Now I'm pleased to introduce Danny Rodrik. Professor Rodrik is the Rafiq Hariri Professor of International Political Economy at the JFK School of Government here at Harvard. He earned his PhD in economics and his MPA at Princeton University, and his research focuses on international economics and economic development. He has earned numerous awards and recognitions for his work, including the inaugural Albert O. Hirschman Prize from the Social Science Research Council in 2007. He's been widely published in scholarly journals, as well as publications like the New York Times and the New Republic, and his books include Has Globalization Gone Too Far? And One Economics, Many Recipes. Professor Rodrik's latest book, The Globalization Paradox, continues his work of challenging the perceived benefits of globalization. The book takes on 3 centuries of economic history and argues that our pursuits of democracy, national autonomy, and economic globalization are at odds with one another, and that going forward we must choose our national priorities.
Thank you all for coming. It's nice to see the crowd here. Let me begin with a confession, which is that I'm an economist. That means you're free to hold me and my friends culpable for everything that we've been going through in the last 3 years. I do think we share some of the blame. But I think I'm a bit of an unusual economist in that if you actually look at the book, you'll see that I'm not trying to sell you globalization. So it's one of these unusual. In this way I want to hold on to it for the whole time. I guess what I've tried to do in this book is play a bit of an unusual role where I try to, on the one hand, explain to economists and the technocrats and the policy people what the concerns of ordinary people about globalization are. And that sort of meant trying to actually understand them and put it in ways and frameworks that could be communicated to the economists, and that's an art in itself. But I also was concerned about trying to explain, why is it that economists think globalization is such a wonderful thing that has done so many good things for so many people around the world. So the book is I hope you'll find, if you look at it, you'll find it. That it's fairly readable. I've tried to make it readable, but there is enough of the economist in it, and that's why I start out with that confession. I was driving a couple of hours ago on the highway, and I was listening to a news program, and there was somebody being interviewed. It was a political, I guess it was a Republican, being interviewed on economic policy, and the subject was the deficit, of course, and he was saying a lot of things about why the deficit ought to be reduced. And he said, and most fundamentally, most importantly, we have to reduce the deficit so that we can compete in the global economy. And I thought about that, and I said, how many times have we heard this? And just remove the bit about we have to reduce the deficit and substitute any and all of whatever you think this country ought to be doing or any other country ought to be doing, and call it X. And we have to do X to compete in the global economy. How many times have we heard that? It's become sort of like a mantra. We have to cut down the government. We have to, it doesn't have to be, it's not just the right wing, it's not just the Republicans, right? Because you also hear we have to invest in our people so we can compete in the world economy. We have to invest in infrastructure so we have to compete in the world economy. We have to invest in R&D so we can compete in the world economy. Any number of things that you want to do. And it just sort of makes you start to think, when did it become the norm that everything we're going to be doing was for the world economy rather than the other way around? Why is it that we're supposed to be doing things for the world economy as opposed to the world economy doing things for us? Wasn't actually sort of the whole idea that globalization and the world markets and this openness and this new era was actually going to be benefiting us. And I think this way of thinking about the relationship between how we fit into globalization is a relatively recent narrative. It's a narrative really of the that started in the 1980s. That suddenly we started to look at the world economy in a very different way. We started to look at us being sort of in the service of the world economy, rather than the other way around. And what I'm trying to do in this book is actually to reverse or provide an alternative narrative, which I think sort of puts globalization in its proper sphere, which is to say, let's look at how globalization can work for us. What does that actually mean for how far we can push the globalization? What it means for the kind of rules we should place on globalization? What it means for the balance between the nation state, domestic policy making on the one hand, and global governance and international institutions on the other. Let me give you a bit of an idea about what's in the book, or what's the nature of the argument in the book, by sort of briefly going over 3 steps in the argument, or 3 building blocks in the argument. The first of these is the idea that markets and governments are complements. They're not substitutes. They say markets and governments go together. They're not at odds with each other. This is another one of these ideas, the fact that sort of markets and the states sort of have to get out of the way so that markets can work well. I think it's been one of the most destructive ideas in terms of our thinking about economic policies. When you think about what makes markets work well only when you have a broad range of strong institutions that underpin those markets. You don't have markets without legal institutions. Markets do not work well without regulatory institutions. Markets are given to instability if you don't have stabilizing institutions. And markets cannot last if you don't have legitimizing institutions. So markets aren't self-creating, they're not self-regulating, they're not self-stabilizing, they're not self-legitimizing. What makes markets last and provide for prosperity are these other institutions, mostly provided by collective action, by the public sector, by government in modern days. Think about the alphabet soup of regulatory institutions that you need to ensure that the products you buy on the marketplace are safe, or that banks most of the time do what they're supposed to be doing, or that when you run into a crisis, that the federal government is there to actually pump liquidity into the system, bail out banks that are going under so that the crisis won't go worse, and so forth. One of the striking regularities around us today is that actually markets work best when the governments are strongest, not the weakest. You can actually give this even a statistical meaning by looking at the correlation between how open an economy is to trade and how large the government or the public sector of an economy is. And this is very positively correlated. The most open economies in the world are in fact the ones where the governments are largest in terms of tax revenue or in terms of public spending. So the first idea is really just to get into our minds that if we want markets to work well, including global markets, we have to have very strong public institutions to ensure that markets work the way that they're supposed to do. The second idea, the second building block here, is the notion that when you think about how the state and various public institutions are organized to provide this infrastructure for market, to provide these undergirding of markets, there is not a single model. That market-based capitalism or market-based systems don't come in a single model. There is an almost infinite variety of models of market capitalism that you can think of. And not one of them is necessarily superior to the other. Every decade we have an idea of what the best model what the best economic model is. Do you remember the Japanese model of the 1980s? Sort of the idea was that here was sort of capitalism at its best, that we need, everybody needed to become more like Japan. Of course, in the 1990s, it was the American model of financial capitalism, and look where that got us. Everybody's now talking about the Chinese model. Do we really want to be like China, or can anybody really be like China? The point is that when you think about how you regulate markets, what kind of labor market institutions to have, what kind of corporate governance, what kind of social protections and the welfare state. There are many, many different ways in which you can arrange those institutions, which means that, in fact, this is one of the major strengths of capitalism and why it has proved so durable, despite all its problems, is that it's very malleable. That you can sort of, the kind of capitalism we had even within a country in the United States, 19th century version of capitalism is very different from what we have today. So capitalism changes both across time and over space, and we shouldn't sort of fixate on this idea that if you want our economies to work well, that there is just one sort of big ideal that we have to all converge to. So second point here is that we really should think about the world as being comprised not as different societies or different market-based economies that are all necessarily converging to one single model, but one where countries ought to be able to express their desires and preferences with respect to exactly the shape those institutions ought to take. So that would be a world in which we accept the legitimate diversity of institutions undergirding capitalism. So that's point number two. Point number, sort of the third building block is the idea that when you think about how we decide collectively about what kind of institutions we should have, what kind of financial regulation, what kind of labor markets, what role should trade unions have in labor markets, how extensive should our social protections and the welfare state be. When we think about how we're designing those specific institutions of capitalism, who should be doing those thinking? And how should we decide? Well, in a democracy, you think that it ought to be decided through democratic deliberation, through democratic mechanisms of decision-making, accountability, and representation, right? And then you ask, what is the appropriate locus of that decision-making? Another way of asking that question is to say, where are political communities organized today in the world? Well, by and large, political communities are organized at the nation state. Don't go looking for global governance anywhere. Don't go looking for global politics anywhere. Don't go looking for any of the institutions in the world having the kind of thick exchange of politics that we see at the nations, at the level of domestic politics. So for very good reasons, and for the foreseeable future, we're going to have politics organized mostly at the level of nation states. That means that the nation state is going to remain with us, and we simply cannot wish it away. And all the talk about a flat world, a world without borders, where domestic governments are disappearing, is simply hogwash. If you look at the recent crisis, when you ask the question, when push comes to shove, who bailed out the banks, who bailed out the auto companies, who pumped the liquidity to inflate the economy, who stabilized demand, and who ultimately was the people actually felt was responsible. The answer to all of that is actually national governments. It wasn't the IMF, it wasn't the World Bank, it wasn't the World Trade Organization. So that's point number three, that political communities remain organized largely around nation states. So when you put those three building blocks together, you get a picture of how we should think about globalization and the future of globalization that I think is quite different from what a lot of sort of chatter around the future of globalization is. And this is a vision, this is a picture which I try to describe at greater detail in my book, which basically says that we need a better balance between the prerogatives of the nation state, between democratic nation states on the other, and the scope and the reach of markets. Since we cannot truly underpin global markets with global institutions democratically governed, we need to reduce our ambitions about how far we can push globalization. We cannot have what I call in the book hyper-globalization, a world in which we're trying to make world markets as integrated, as unified, as well-functioning as domestic markets. That might seem obvious, but it's remarkable how much of our policy efforts at the international level, in domestic level, are animated by that view, as if we can keep pushing on lowering barriers, removing barriers, so that we can have this single unified global market, when that's really an impossibility. So this is a vision of globalization, which I try to sketch out in the book, that puts the national democracies front and center, that says the global rules ought to leave room for domestic policymakers to design their own policies, their own institutions, their own preferences. And second, that you might think that this would be actually very detrimental to the world economy if all countries, all democracies in the world and other nation states were to decide just to go on the basis of what they want to do, that this might be the collapse of the world economy. I argue that that is in fact not correct. That is not true. A world in which, a world of democracies in which countries decide their own policies and settle on their own institutions, is actually a world that's going to be much more conducive to a healthy globalization than one where we simply try to rein in domestic policymakers as much as possible. And the reason for that is going back to where I started out with, which is that we can have a globalization, an economic globalization, only to the extent that people believe and actually see in practice that that is working towards the kinds of ends, both economic and social, that people want to see. And that's possible only when we have that kind of control and the strong institutional underpinnings of globalization are actually provided, and they can only be provided at the level of the nation states. So in a nutshell, this is what the book is about. It's about trying to argue something that might seem on the face of it counterintuitive and paradoxical, that we actually are going to have a better globalization, a healthier globalization, a better functioning world economy, if we actually give some more power to nation states, instead of assuming that we can keep sort of moving towards sort of global institutions or global governance or global rules or global governance that's going to help us create the world market work better. So let me just stop here. I'm happy to ask questions. I'm happy to get. I'm always happy to ask questions. I'm also happy to get some. So including those who want to disagree with me. So thanks again for coming. I'm happy to listen to you now.